I have taken this project as far as I can right at this point, pending a few decisions on your part, unless I've completely missed some serious points. So I wanted to just review where that had arrived us to this point. First, this is a condition of the plot plan right now for this, and I have taken this from the overlay, the county overlay, the scaled county overlay. I didn't measure from the face of your house out here to the center of this street, so this is kind of roughed in, but I have overlaid that as close as I can, and this appears to be accurate. If the photo were to shift, as it looks like it has to shift a little bit to the right, that only makes our situation worse over here. So I think this is pretty accurate, reliable for them. This is the 20-foot by 21-foot patio, concrete portion of it, or the corners. And as I don't know if you could see that it's coming over this red setback line, 25-foot rear yard setback line. It's coming over that a little bit, about 2.5 feet or 10%. To get it inside there, we would be shrinking it back to 18.4. And then there's the chimney as well. And when you bring it back out to 20 feet, you have a slight intrusion with the chimney. I don't think that's a problem at all. I think those are actually allowed to intrude into the backyard. But this little 7 square foot area, I don't know if that is going to trigger the need for a variance or not, but it would be an open and shut case in any event. It's just a case of they would get you for another $300 to $500, whatever they charge down there for such a thing. Because everything's open back there, considering what you're backing up to here, I don't think anybody would give you a problem about that 7 square feet. I put the house together as much as I needed to be able to design something decent back here. Including this, I felt like this was a pretty decent part of the whole structure, even though, to my recollection, we're not expanding that or changing that beyond taking out what we have to take out at this east end. Now, I have to cover a variety of things, so if it seems like I'm rushing, I'm not. I just don't want this to last a long time. First of all, coming in here, it is approximately 24 inches from this first floor level down to the patio here where it's going to meet. In all of my drawings, I am showing this, and the contractor can set this a little bit higher at this end if he likes, and I would, just to make these steps closer to 7.5 inches each if there's going to be 2 of them. But I have this thing sloped from the wall northward at 3/16 of an inch per foot, which I wouldn't go less than that, or there will be some ponding water. And they can do other creative things in terms of how it slopes. If the concrete guy wants to, they can tilt that a different way or tilt it this way or that. For all my drawings, though, I tilted it from the wall 3/16 per foot going north. And that meant you have about 7 inches here, 7 or 8 here, and then you have an option of having one stair here, or coming up here, and then the second riser in is straight into the house, is one way to do it. The second way is to have 2 of these stairs down where the top one is level with your first floor. I briefly explored going to 4 risers all the way down, but they're so short, about 6 inches apiece, and you would have to have them so long to make it make sense. So that was abandoned. Now, I will only say this once in the film, but as I brought this design along, I had initially, obviously the corners will be square, the ones out at the north end, or at least at this northeast end, will be square, and when I make it just as wide as this, which is 23 inches, these are finishing at 22 inches. That's what I have based it on, finishing those at 22 inches. However, you can see how close that stone comes to the door. And once I got finished with this, I felt that these would look just as well if they were pushed, same size, same 22 by 22 square or 22 by 24 depending on where it's located. If those are pushed out that way and out that way, so that just the stone veneer is in front of the brick on this side and in front of the brick on that side, I think that is going to be at least as acceptable a solution as this, where it's very tight here and very tight here. I don't think that's going to look very good. I think this one can be just pushed that way 1.5 inches or the thickness of the stone, and that one 1.5 inches or the thickness of the stone. So just know that going forward that was my feeling on those, and I felt like in the construction drawings I would just go ahead and pull those 1.5 inches in each direction. And then the columns, that's a 7¼ inch finish with its cladding. Now I'll also only say this once. These upper walls, everything above here can be built of 6-inch concrete block and then faced with whatever stone you're facing it with. The next thing was the height of these piers. And because you had said you wanted a bar type thing, I started from those at 4'0" from this floor here. And that, I would take that dimension out there at the lower slope, 4 feet at the tallest, which would be at the far north end of that bar section, and then level everything to that, which means they will be somewhat shorter up here, possibly as short as 3'9" maybe. But I didn't want them too squat coming out the door, and I wanted it tall enough to be a bar coming in here. At the end of the project, I lower them by 4 inches, and you will just have to experiment and see what that feels like to you. Because if we have it 4 foot inside, then on the patio side it's going to be 4'8", this wall, and it might get a little bit heavy feeling. But if we drop it 4 inches, that is about level with 2 or 3 inches below the top of your deck railing now, if that helps you to get a feel for it. And then these are some of the other dimensions coming in. I talked to Chris about this. This is the beam up here, and I did not want the bottom of that finished beam to be any lower than the top of this door, this lintel here at the door. So that's pretty much where the height is called out, is no lower than that for the finished beam. And then putting the roof on with a 5/12 pitch at the top chord and a 3/12 pitch at the bottom. This is what you end up with, where the peak actually comes out about level with the top of this. This is about an 8/12 pitch here, but that comes out about level with the top of that. And the bottom just about captures this brick, and we might be able to drop that a little bit lower depending on what happens with the beams. Here are the beams that I started to draw in, and these are 14-inch shown. This is what I found out from putting the input into the beam sizing program. In terms of that A-beam, if we specify 3 members, and these are various widths or heights we can use on microlamp LVLs, then these are the solutions if we use 3 of these. And if you look at these, if you start with the small one, you can see where the bend comes up here in the deflection. And as you increase that, it becomes stiffer and has less deflection. I would think that this is the minimum that I would want to. Any of them will pass. Any of these will pass code all the way down to 3 9¼ But I would consider this a better solution than any of those first 3, which is 3/11 7/8. And I don't really see a need to go any higher than that. I mean, yes, it gets stiffer, and you can if you want. And this is kind of an idea to tell how it's going up in cost. Finally, if you wanted, still we're going to work with the 14-inch height, and just went with 2 plies instead of 3. These then are your solutions. And 2 14s is about as stiff, apparently, as 3 12s. So I would think 3 12s is what 3/11 7/8 is what I would rely on. So that is about as stiff as 2 14s. 3 14s is very rigid. You can see here. So this was showing the 3 14s, and it is easier to just use 3 members because of the cap connections at the top. You don't have to do so much shimming or blocking. So I replaced those 14-inch, those 3 14s with 3/11 7/8 and put a 2x6 cap on top of those. And I realized these columns might end up a little thicker, because a lot of times with those connectors you have to either chow out your cladding or fur out your cladding. So you'll have to use your own experience there. I also am showing these columns the same finished width as the beam, which is standard. But if you do this a different way, particularly if you don't use column caps, anything decorative, which I'll show at the end of the film, these outer cladding can come down on the face of those. For what it's worth, it's going to take about 14 or 15 inches inside and 7 or 8 outside. So this inside one, either you have to buy that wide stuff from Mirrortech or whomever, or you have to couple that up with an 11 1/4 and some other member. All of these columns here, these can be built of frame, but I'm showing them all built of cement masonry units, blocks, and then these ones, this is the foundation. A 22-inch finish pier is arising from an 18-inch wide or 18-inch square, whatever the case may be, foundation block, and I assume that's all 8-inch coming up. And then at the first floor level, I would just bring this the rest of the way up. I think you had an option of coming up. If you come up with 4-inch everywhere, you can bring your foundations up above the level of the concrete and then have that full grouted at the bottom and grout your base connectors into that, and then set your 6x6s and build 4-inch CMU around that. There's not really space to build 6-inch around it and have some gap between it and the column so that that doesn't get any kind of swaying or cracking. I think probably the best solution is just to come up with these piers, have all the block done at once and come all the way up to the finished level, and then have your connectors grouted into the top of those piers. And I realize 1'6" is not a standard kind of block dimension, so they'll have to buy the extra 10 inches or whatever it takes to do that infill work. The only exception to bringing that all up in 8-inch block and then putting these on top is the back wall of the bar, because if the pier itself is 22 inches wide, if this is 6-inch block coming up here faced with stone on both sides, it's going to be pushing 10 inches thick at this location, which would leave you 12 inches, 13 from the edge of the bar under here to the face of that rock. So if the mason thinks that 4-inch block can hold up along here and do fine, I would run the back wall of that in 4-inch block. Turning our attention to the chimney wall on the mantelpiece, and this is going to be kind of ugly for a little while till we get it refined, but this, in terms of, you have to decide how high you want that hearth where you're able to sit on it. I am, in my drawing so far, in my model so far, and I haven't shown anything different than that, I have that hearth at 16 inches from the finished concrete at that end. Now a kitchen chair is about 18 inches, so whether you want it lower or higher, let me know, but it impacts where the television can go, because the higher that hearth is, the higher the fireplace goes, and that means the higher these mantelpieces go. And if that's going to be a wood mantelpiece, it's going to have to be so high off of this thing. If this is combustible, and if it was 12-inch deep, it had to be 24 inches above the fireplace opening. If it's non-combustible, it can be within 4 inches of the fireplace opening, the mantelpiece, this piece here. This was their little sketch of recommended if you're going to put a TV above there. This isn't going to happen, at least not to my recollection or my, it can happen. I just haven't shown that or modeled it. I'm assuming the TV is mounted on the wall, and they are showing this as kind of an idea. They're just being extra safe, and so I'll go through this. This next series is all about this chimney wall, and really takes us through a lot of the rest of the project. As I said, this is not finished, but here are the starting points. 16 inches for the hearth, and the fireplace, I've modeled this based on that courtyard that you had seen, and some of the other models are similar. I'm also, through all of this, I'm showing a 42-inch wide, their 42-inch wide model, the courtyard 42 instead of the 36, because this TV is going to be pretty wide and the chimney is going to be pretty wide. So I'm showing a 42-inch wide fireplace. And then I went a foot above the opening to the surface of this non-combustible mantelpiece, and I have that as 10 inches deep in the models that you'll see. Based on all this, and then putting this up an additional for the TV for a little more heat protection, and your TV may not have as fat a frame down here, but this is where it comes to the center of the TV under that arrangement. 7'10" to the top of the TV and about 80 inches to the center of the TV. Now if you bring this, whatever you bring this hearth down, all of those dimensions can come down. However, because I thought 80 inches was pretty high to begin with, I actually bring this and 5 foot for the mantle was a bit high as well. I bring this mantle down to where it's about 4'6" from the finished floor. So we pick up another 5 or 6 inches here. Whether that TV comes down with it, in my models it does come down with it, so that the center of it's closer to 74 inches. But those are things to think about with regard to this hearth and your television. I would kind of map that out in your mind or on your wall and see what it feels like. So because I did that, I'm not showing it in this sort of a view. All of these coming photographs and slides are based on that thing dropping 5 or 6 inches and the television. So you may have to use your mind to push the television up or one way or the other to make it more like what you're looking for. And these are the first looks at this structure from outside. You can see here underneath, this is what I assume you were thinking about when you're talking about a bar. I might be completely wrong, and perhaps you're going to expand that patio and that bar is going to be hung over on the east or the west side. This is shown with 4-inch block on the back, faced with stone on both sides, giving you about 14-inch underneath there. And that's closer to 12, which is probably enough considering you probably aren't going to have seating there. If you're going to have some sort of seating there, stools or whatever, you'll have to think about what side, because the top of those bar seats should be 12 inches below the top of this finished bar if someone's going to be sitting at that bar. So keep that in mind when this is called out, how high you want that to be. Are you going to have seating there, and or can you lean on it appropriately? Over here I did not explore, again ignore this whole end for now, but I didn't explore because I didn't think it was part of the project, expanding this patio and having this bar come out this way as well, or in addition or lower or whatever, and bringing this rock out and bringing this landscape stone out in front of it. But I did want to mention it in case that was one of the things. Now here is the stairs to the house. That's the single, the stair one is, and there's, just ignore that. This is where I'm talking about. This face of this would be better, I think, if it came out here 1.5 inches or the thickness of the stone. But here is the first step, and I show that really deep since it's just the one. I show that probably 18 inches deep. The alternative is to come up with a couple 11 inches, it must have been 22 inches deep. Come up with that, come up with 2 of these at about 11 inches apiece. So the one that's about 20 or so, maybe 22, or the 2. I have opted to go with that for now because I just think it's better. And I'm assuming that if there's a brick course here, that that's removed and that that concrete is run in, so for a seamless look here. Taking a quick look underneath here, this is the foundation plan essentially, just these piers. This one comes up a little further here. The piers penetrate the concrete with your expansion strips everywhere they meet, and your concrete person should have a knowledge of where to put these control joints, because these square columns can be a problem with the concrete cracking. So it could be that you need control joints, and I would have them tooled, not machined, in these 16-inch increments, or some way to keep that concrete from cracking. So be sure that that is covered. And I will send a diagram over to my concrete person and see what he suggests as a control joint diagram, and I'll show that on the plan. This shows you the ceiling, the first look at the ceiling. I think we'll have to have a piece of trim up here where this meets the brick. You can see we're just, I'm not even sure what that horizontal piece is, what we're seeing there, but it's almost at the top of the brick. And then a couple shots from the inside, just for the moment, on this A plan. It was shaping up something like this. And this was with these still at 4 feet out here. So from the surfaces, we really don't want it too much lower. maybe 3 or 4 inches tops, because from standing on this step you don't want that so low. In terms of the actual floor plan, this paver patio and its little pathway is pretty close to what you have from my dimensions and photographs. And I bring the edge of this pier here and the edge of this bar here up to the edge of that paver border. And these are the dimensions you end up with down along here. Then this is about 2 feet here, and your bar area, the whole bar is 7'7" with about 7 foot underneath. But the whole length of the thing is closer to 9'10". The whole slab is closer to 9'10". But this was the first A plan. These are the model numbers here. In this A plan, I had brought this chimney wall, and this is based on that narrow fireplace. It only needs a 28-inch deep framing cavity, so we end up with about 28 inches on the outside to outside wall. In this first plan, Plan A, I have that pushed in to where the surface of that chimney wall is flush with the surface of this corner pier. I felt that was pushing into the room a little bit much, so at first I pushed it all the way back like this, where this beam that was at the end, or this false beam that was at the end, and there's a lot of story about that yet, but where that passes in front of that stone and all of the stone rises up behind it. And then coming further along, the alternative was to have a portion of that false beam die into the side of those chimney walls, and the face of that come over its face, similar to what happens at the face of your house if you look at your frieze board up there on that stone gable. Finally though, when I started to develop this further along, when I got to the corner, I felt that the end wall was best treated by pushing, because we were getting such a large overhang with it way out there. We were having to have an overhang that was pushing over 20 inches, and you don't have any gable overhangs on your ends of your house, although you do have maybe 12 or 14 out front. But I thought that was a big overhang at that side, so I pushed it in, and this was I even pushed it in further than that, like this. Ignore this is just a truss. Now where we have this termination beam, or this rake end beam, or whatever you want to call it here, it's completely dying into the side of the chimney, and the stone is coming up to the bottom of the ceiling with this false beam here going into that stone. These are going to be various shots with some confusion, but this is that first look where I had this end beam. When I had a chunkier end beam like that, it came in front. The front member of that end beam, false end beam, came in front of this rock chimney, and the bottom of that, at that point, the bottom of this gable end beam was being called out by the bottom of this soffit here. Rotate this around. I was having the bottom of this come out with the bottom of that. Presuming there's a return board here, and then there's the bottom of that. And on this permutation, I was running the siding all the way down to the bottom of that beam. You could run it up and have more of the beam shown if that beam is used. I ended up at the end, I kind of got that beam really minimalized. Whether you like that more than something like this is another thing to think about. But there it was with the siding all the way down to the bottom of that false beam, and here it was with some exposure of the false beam. Coming inside though, this is what it would look like inside on that last permutation. But leaving that gable end situation alone and focusing on the chimney for a minute, I thought it was a little wider than it had to be, all things considered, for scale. So I have brought that down by about 5 or 6 inches to something like this, and I think that's a better width for it, particularly with the 42-inch fireplace. It could probably go even a little bit smaller than that, another couple inches smaller than that. And then trying to reduce some of that mass, I'm assuming that it was an idea something like this going in, or some sort of thing where it wasn't just a big block going up. And this was just me experimenting. These were the caps at the slope of this upper chord here, the 512, and I think they will look better. Now that's a 1412, Now this is a 12-12 pitch on those. This is a 14-12 pitch, and I brought those down to 10-12 pitch. That's what your front gable is, and that kind of looks good. Keep in mind now, again, we still have this hearth and how high this chimney goes to get this all proportioned right. I'd like to see those no higher than this, but they can be if the play calls for it. Right now I have them at 7'5" to the bottom of those little legs, and this is if we go in this direction. I can't make this I could make this a whole tapered wall, but your rock would have to be something that's not what you have out front. Those tapered walls, you almost have to use actual stone because of the limitations. But finalizing this out, or at least finalizing it out to this point, arrives us here. And if these columns are just square, maybe there are some simple trim at the top and bottom of them. You can have these finished columns. I have a call in to see if these are available, if you were to use something like this, to see if any of these are available in a height that will work for us, which is about 52 inches, give or take 3 or 4, depending on what we do with these bar tops. Now when we get down to here, and you'll see from the next photos, the finished photos at the outside, I have lowered this bar top some. I have lowered that. Maybe that's what happens here. It happens here where I'm lowering that top by 3 or 4 inches. But that brings your bar down to about maybe 3'8" out here. I don't think that you're going to use these tapered ones. I did want to see if those were available where you wouldn't have to custom build them. But more likely maybe it has a little more of a finished look, and maybe that's column wraps that is done in a vinyl or some similar material, composite. So that's the other thing to think about, is your columns, how those are going to be, whether they're going to be super simple like that or something more elaborate. Alright, very last, recognizing I could be off the mark on some of this, hopefully not too much of it, and hopefully this at least helps us to refine where we want to go from here. These are some finished photographs of where I brought it to this point, and if you look at this last one, you'll see this is G, and I end up pushing this forward and I minimize that thing where it just provides a place for the tongue and groove ceiling to stop. So there's only about 1.5 inches here. You can see how big this overhang is when I have that pushed back. This is one of the early ones, and that overhang is 20 or 22 inches, which is a bit much to me. And yeah, I guess you could trim it and have it come up with a little notch, and I guess if you did that you'd trim it here, but you would have no gutter up here, I don't think, anyway, and that means that's going to be coming down on that. So I opted to push that in one of the later models. Oh, this is just, yeah, some trim back here at the brick. Now here it was with this beam and pushed in, and this is where I kind of ended up with, although I minimized that beam like this. And additionally, in the final permutation like this. Now here's where these piers come down 4 inches. And I think if you can get by with a shorter bar out there, it's probably better than taller. But you have to decide that. The other thing I do, whether that happens or not, up here, the way I did this, once I pushed this in, I was able to get this soffit pushed back to closer to 18 inches maybe, and I brought that soffit closure on the surface of this beam here. So this becomes, 8 or 9 inches, and then this is another 8 or 9 or whatever it takes to make that return at that end. That's how it was pushed back like that. And we could reduce that. See, you can see the big overhang sticking out here. We could reduce that if we took the chimney up through the roof and just a foot above the roof and put a metal cap on it. Then we could bring this overhang into whatever we'd like at that end, which maybe 10 or 12 inches make more sense. I did not model that, however. I did not show that because I don't think it was in the offing to bring that chimney up when it wasn't required. Instead, I brought the whole assembly forward like this, And once we didn't have to worry about the interface here, we're able to push that beam up some. It just doesn't have to be that big, and it's actually oversized here, but I didn't want it dying into there at a smaller height. I wanted to make it look sense like these were rafters. So, but this is a much better arrangement, I think, all things considered. Presumably there's a little bit of trim up here, 1.5 or 2-inch trim up here. This is where I reduced that gable trim. It's really just about 1.5 inches nailed to the bottom of that tongue and groove, and then the siding outside is finished down either right to its top edge or right to its bottom edge. Here is the columns going down. The lighting changes, but here are the columns going down. And you can also see this is where I brought that board all the way in, because once I got rid of this tall beam here, I couldn't see a decent interface for the end of this soffit here, except doing something like that. These are just some different columns. And from this end, you can see where how I divide this, which is the only thing anyone would do. Now, you can see the overhang, a fairly decent overhang, and when I push that in 5 or 6 inches, that helps that quite a bit. And you can also see if I wanted to reduce it even further, say to the edge of these things here, the chimney would have to go up through like that with a cap on it. It will keep more rain out with this big overhang here. And this was with regard to this gable end siding and that gable beam, whether that happens. This looks pretty decent like this, but you might want something super trim like this. Here's the 4-inch drop on those. Personally, I think that's better, but you'll have to make a judgment on it. And the beam goes up then, that center beam goes up. These are the same photos, it's just a different development mode if it's easier to see or feel. And that is it. This has been great fun. I was worried that I wasn't going to be able to come up with anything. And at least at the moment, I feel like this is something that we can expand from. I guess the only other thing, we could even reduce this upper part of the chimney here. If we did a similar, say that thing doesn't have to be as tall, if we did a similar slab thing from about here up, and we pushed this back an additional 4 or 5 inches, and so it would have a sloped piece here interfacing with these, like a little hip here, which that would work as well, but it would be more work. Anyway, that's it. Let me know about any of this, and thanks.